In the next episode of Children of Heroes, we traveled about 2 hours west from London to the historic city of Bath, where we talked to Mr. Paul Anthony Kašpar, son of Major Miloslav František Kašpar.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes.
My pleasure.
Your father served in the Czechoslovak army in the UK during the Second World War. But if the war hadn't come, he might have become a professional footballer for Sparta Praha.
That's right, yes. In fact, as a teenager, he played with Sparta Prague Juniors, and then at age 18, he joined their second team and played games actually into Germany and around. And then when it was the time for conscription and signing up into the army, and he was very keen to join the army. I think he was probably about 20 when he went into the army.
In 1939, he escaped to Poland and
That's
joined
right.
the Polish military intelligence.
Yeah.
What was his role there?
Essentially, it was a kind of spying role looking at the build-up of the German munitions on the frontier and so on, and coming back and reporting that back. So quite a dangerous role. It involved travelling from Poland back into Prague at times. And there was one particular time when he had some of the information about the sightings of German military armaments on little scraps of paper, and had been then not exactly caught by Germans who were then occupying Prague, but actually being interviewed quite in a sort of hard style by them. And whilst waiting for his interview, he was sitting by a fire in the outbuilding and had some sweets in his pocket, and so ate sweets and crumpled up the little bits of secret information into the sweet wrappers and chucked them into the fire, because had the Nazis found that on him, they would have been executed straight away. So one of his many escapes from a dangerous situation.
He was captured by the Red Army and spent 9 months in a prison camp.
Yes, he was moved around quite a lot. I think it was in autumn of 1939 when the Soviets and the Germans invaded in a sort of coordinated push on Poland, and he was caught then along with his other Czech soldiers, and they were then moved around prison of war camps for 9 months. In each camp they moved into, he was reading Polish graffiti on the walls, and it was of the Polish officers. And then suddenly there was no more graffiti. And that was after Katyn, when all the 20,000 Polish officers had been executed by the Soviets. In fact, he was released because the Czech soldiers were not regarded as prisoners of war, but as detainees, because technically the Soviets hadn't declared war on Czechoslovakia at that point. So eventually, as the war turned, they were released in Odessa, and he with his fellow combatants managed to find their way back via Turkey, Syria and the Mediterranean to southern France, and then were enlisted with the French army, sent up country to the advancing Nazi push that was just coming around Paris at that time, and helped fight a rearguard action, blowing up bridges with a Bren gun team. He was always proud to tell me that Bren guns came from Brno. Proud of his Czech roots, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre from the French army, which he was very proud of. But then retreated in an 8-day or 9-day march without any sleep whatsoever. And he describes how people were hallucinating. They were so tired. They'd send an advance party to the next village to go and smash all the bottles of wine, because if they came across that, they would just drink and relax and be captured. It was a very dramatic retreat, pretty much down until the point when the French army surrendered and they were left without arms, washed up in southern France. And only then, after quite a long wait down on the beaches of Agde, he got the very last boat that picked up he and some fellow Czech soldiers, and via Gibraltar they finally came to England.
Where he joined the military intelligence of the
That's right,
Czechoslovak army.
Exactly, yeah. They arrived in Plymouth and then they stationed with the other Czech soldiers up in Chumley Park. And from there, their next move was to Leamington, which was a key part of the Czech story in the war. He met my mother there. So he joined a team of Czech footballers. There was a whole string of football matches put on against the British Army team, and then they toured and played with the big named teams. And Picture Post ran an article, and my father is featured several times. 2 weeks before my mother first met my father, had got this edition and looked and thought, "Ooh, he looks nice." A friend of my younger brother, David, found a clip from Pathé News from 1941 that actually shows the match itself. So you can see my father, it was at a military dance, and he was a young lieutenant of 27 years old, and my mum was 19, and she was very kind of smitten with this handsome soldier who had already had quite an experience of the world. I've got a lovely photo of them at their first date in Leamington. They put on a party for Svatý Mikuláš, and my mum, that was her first sort of introduction to Czech culture, and she absolutely loved it.
Your father was a close friend of Kubiš and Gabčík?
That's right, yeah, right back to their days in Poland, and I think fought together in France. At the point when there was the early plans to assassinate Heydrich, so he trained his sort of fellow soldiers, Gabčík, Kubiš, and the others in the seven parachutists, essentially. That involved sort of working with British special services and their training up in Scotland, and it came to the time for actually selecting what was going to be clearly a suicide mission, because there was no way out really from what they were planning. He put himself forward, but I think because he spoke relatively good English at that time, and British intelligence found him quite useful in his other roles, he wasn't able to go himself, but he had to choose of his crew.
They were my own boys. They were from my platoon in Morton Paddocks. And when that officer from London came to ask for chaps with special qualities, one had to consider independence, initiative, immediate decision, reaction, toughness, physical, moral, because they had to be under terrific pressure from any point of view.
And as we know, they were ultimately successful, but with a sort of tragic end in the church. Every time I go to Prague, we go down in the crypt.
In 1944, he helped to escort the Czechoslovak government in exile to Slovakia.
That's right, yes, yeah. He had been given orders that there was about to be a departure, and they got quite a quick turnaround marriage in about 3 weeks or so. That was in August 1944, and eventually he left, I think, in November 44 to accompany the Czech government in exile. And again, he found himself coming back via the Black Sea from, I think, Odessa or East Romania possibly. And together they pushed westwards through Romania and eventually were kept on the border of Prague, ready to liberate. Coming through Romania, his troops he was commanding fought off a Nazi attack on a particular Romanian small town. And for that he was awarded Romanian Knight's Cross, which again he was very proud of. But coming to Prague, he was coming in conjunction with the Red Army together. And it was at a time when left in Prague were, I think, an SS battalion who, even though it was very clear that the war was over, were hell-bent on just shooting up the city and doing as much damage as they could before finally retreating. But during that street fighting that happened then, unfortunately, my uncle Pepa, my father's elder brother, was taking ammunition to one of the barricades in the street, and the Nazis, the SS, caught him and executed him in front of his wife and daughter, who was 12. So,
What your father did after the war?
First of all, my mother came and joined him in Prague. So for 3 years, he was involved still as a soldier in the Czech army. I think at that point he had become a major. He and my mother had a very happy 3 years, and she learnt Czech. And part of the time they stayed with my father's mother, my grandmother, and my mother learnt to cook from her as well, because she claims all she could do was boil an egg before she went to Prague. But there she learnt all the dishes that we came to love as children, the koláčes, pešvý koláč, jablkový koláč, buchty, all the favourites. But then came in 1948 and my father was sacked from the army. One of the reasons was he'd, right throughout the war years, had quite a suspicious eye on communist activity within the army, and he'd made his name known already as quite an anti-communist. He had to escape because he'd already lost friends who had been captured, imprisoned, disappeared. My mother managed to fly back to Britain, and my father, just with a pair of brown boots and a pistol and a compass, set off across in snowy mountains on foot and crossed over, I think, into Bavaria, an American zone, handed in his papers and made himself available to them. My mother, back in Leamington Spa, had left him, not knowing if she'd ever see him again. The telegram that he sent through to her saying, safely arrived, love, Mila. That's it. I can imagine what that was like, receiving that telegram. And then after that, having been debriefed by, I think, CIA and British Secret Services, etc., to get what information, intel they could, he kind of rejoined my mother back in the UK. And after that, wasn't sure what on earth he was going to do, but his old commanding officer, General Inge, who was already involved with the French Deuxième Bureau, offered him a job over in Paris. And so he and my mother moved to Paris for several years. He was working with the Deuxième Bureau. In that whole beginnings of the Cold War, I think my mother was probably living in quite a lot of innocence about what my father's role was, because when you're doing those kind of roles, you can't share the information. He then moved, I think, to Germany briefly, to Innsbruck, and the main intention was to be effectively running agents into communist Czechoslovakia. So he was handling the running of the agents to try and gather intelligence. Post that, he was then working with MI5 and then was sent out to Beirut, to Lebanon, again running agents there.
You were with him?
I was at that point, I was actually born then, but sadly have no memories of it. I was about that size. I've got photos of him and us. His surface ostensible cover job was to work for Skyways, I think an American airline. And this is the reason I don't speak Czech. He was working under the assumed identity as though he were British, but with a very strong Czech accent. So this was a false passport issued to him by Secret Services for Mr. Miles, France's kingdom. And that gave him the excuse whereby he could fly to Cairo, Damascus, Karachi, all around Jordan and so on. So
was it his last mission?
Cyprus, I think, was after that, yeah. But again, I think he was still running the same kind of activity. And I think at that point, the Middle East was very much a kind of sorting ground for defectors and swapping of intelligence. I know that traitor Kim Philby was out there for a while in Beirut as well, possibly at the same time as my father. So my father was lucky not to have been betrayed by Philby. Eventually, that then came to an end, that whole mission, and they came back to Britain and lived in London, moved down to just outside Croydon, and that's really where I remember growing up and going to school. And my parents stayed there and lived there about 48 years, which is the longest my father had ever been anywhere.
He retired.
Yeah, he then got a job in export, funnily enough, working with the Middle East. And I do sometimes wonder whether he still carried on as a kind of cover job, because he was regularly flying to Damascus, Tel Aviv, Cairo, Karachi. But by then he had 3 sons and he became keen to just be a good family father. I was very aware he was living as a refugee. He gained British citizenship, I think, in 1959 or 60. But he was a refugee and an exile and couldn't go back to Czechoslovakia. And it meant a lot that he couldn't. And he devoted really his whole active life right up until the Velvet Revolution to trying to campaign for the freedom of Czechoslovakia and for his people. This was my father's visit back to Prague in the early 1990s, for the first time just drinking Pilsner and a feeling of, at last, back in his country. After the Velvet Revolution, my father was invited to Prague by President Havel, who promoted him to the honorary rank of Major General. Through that role became leader of the Czech Legions group in Britain, and in the latter years was regularly at Brookwood, sadly, doing the funeral orations for more old soldiers, and is now buried in Brookwood.
You studied French and philosophy.
That's right,
at
yes.
Oxford University, but decided to teach film and video production, which is quite a change.
Well, I did start by teaching French first, and then I was offered a year's secondment to an educational television company who were producing documentaries and educational TV. And part of the deal was that they would fully train me in camera work, editing, sound mixing, and the scripting and if you like, the research and how to put together a program. And I suddenly realised this is what I should be doing. It was like all the kind of creative things that I'd enjoyed, you know, photography and writing and images and storytelling came together in one medium. So I spent much of my time then in Dorset working with students. I really loved it. Well, we ran a production company to make money to help sponsor some of the projects we were doing. The profits from our company would then pay for us to do location film shoots. So we would take them all off to the coast of Wales, create scripts and shoot drama, sort of giving them opportunities that normally they wouldn't have been able to have. One of those students, Gareth Unwin, later on won an Oscar for producing the King's Speech.
Your passion is black and white photography?
It is now, yes. In the last 10 years, I've just developed this passion again for going right back to the old style photography. I love the whole process of it. So I develop film myself, and then I scan the negatives into Photoshop and do the kind of darkroom work actually digitally. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of hybrid. My father bought this camera back in 1948 and took it all over the world. I think because it was a very compact camera and it's still working perfectly. So I load it.
Still use it?
Yeah, one of many cameras I use, but it's quite unique in that it's actually got a clockwork so that if I were to take a photo, it automatically winds the film on. He took all our family photos for years with that. In some ways, I think that sparked off my love of kind of old retro cameras. I'm very fond of this photo I took of my father with my old Rolleiflex. He was down visiting us and was sitting looking out of the window into the garden, and soft light coming through, and just sort of caught him in a reflective moment, and just sort of, if like, picks out his profile rather than the whole image. So the detail of his hands and the veins on his hands, it's all kind of very personal to me. I've managed to join a group of documentary photographers here called Photo Bath. They've accepted me as an associate with them, so I can now sort of join in with exhibitions and galleries that they do.
How has your Czech heritage influenced your life? Oh,
so much in so many ways. I mean, I'm still very proud to have the Czech surname Kašpar, and made sure I hang on to the Haček on the S. And since the Velvet Revolution and so on, I've been able to go back and reform links with my cousins who are still in Prague, and we see each other regularly and are in touch, and at Christmas we do video calls. And the other thing that has influenced me a lot too is there's a kind of surreal trait in Czech culture, and I was teaching animation to students, and I used to use the films of Jan Svankmajer, and that's a very Czech way of responding to the world. And in his case, I think perhaps, you know, responding to the repression of a regime was to go off laterally into a completely different direction. And I think the Czechs have always had that ability, right back to my father's favourite book, Švejk. That kind of rebellious attitude to authority, I think I've probably inherited that too.